Abilify, Lexapro, Wellbutrin, Zoloft, and Prozac. Any of these would dramatically have changed Amos' message to us today, right? Have you ever heard a prophet that sounded more in need of medication or yourself felt more in need of a therapist after listening to a prophet than Amos? He is not just a doom and gloom prophet. Amos brings a sense of sadness, of hurt, of depression that makes us wonder, is this really a word from the Lord? Or was Amos just really a miserable human being? Was his life that bad? Or were God's people that bad? The prophets were known to be messengers with tough words. They were supposed to speak truth to power, but aren't there limits? Today, Amos brings a word from God where God tells us, I despise your religious gatherings. I will not listen to your songs or receive your offerings. Keep it. I don't want it. Ouch! Were the people really that bad? Well, yeah. Yeah, things had gotten pretty rough for God's people. There had become traditions of financial exchange that, this will surprise you all in our current American context, were not exactly fair. People took advantage of those who were poor. They allowed their wealth to create more wealth on the backs of those who were doing the work. They forgot a lot of the law that was so much a part of their community identity. They were charging interest to their brothers and sisters, even those that couldn't afford it. They were charging extra for things, and they were even using illegally weighted scales so that as they were trying to figure out how much they owed someone for grain, they provided the scale, and it made sure they didn't have to pay as much as they needed, or they were overcharging people for other things. There was a sense of corruption throughout the community, and this is within their Jewish community. These are their brothers and sisters in faith. Those, as Amos reminds them, they came through the wilderness with generations before. So Amos explains that when you break community, when you hurt your brothers or sisters, when you break covenant with your church family, your faith family, when you put yourself above the community, you distance yourself from God. You push God away. It was their competition, their greed, their own choices that isolated them from God. So God has some tough choices to make. God can keep yelling, keep hollering at them, stop doing that. You such and suches. God can keep begging, please, please, for the love of God, get along with each other. God can keep parenting, but at some point God decides to try some tough love. And tough love it is from Amos. Where is this more evident than verse 24? It's interesting. This is one of those often quoted, put on t-shirts and plaques to hang on our living room wall passages. But verse 24 has often been misused or misunderstood. Let justice roll down like waters and righteousness like an ever-flowing stream. But it usually gets said, let justice roll down like waters and righteousness like an ever-flowing stream. Aww. Doesn't that sound lovely? It should almost have a nature scene behind it, sitting next to our picture of little kittens doing something cute. I imagine it being cross-stitched in very soft, gentle colors. But these people lived in a dry, arid place. When the rain came, it wasn't gentle. It wasn't puppies and kitties and warm and fuzzy. When the rains came, things changed. Righteousness, like an ever-flowing stream, it's rains that never stop. It's a continual eroding, destroying of the landscape that they knew. This is not soft and tender. This is a threat. This is, don't make me stop this car on the way into exile. God offers some tough love. Amos is informing the people of God's decision to reshape them, to reform them, to make something new from what has been. And that tool, as Amos warns them, is the exile. Beyond Damascus, he says, you will take your kings that you've made for yourself, your star gods, your graven images. It was those things from the communities around them that they had incorporated into their culture. It was their idols, going against one of those first 10 rules, if you remember them in the wilderness, about not having graven images, not put anything before God. So Amos tells them, God is sending you into exile, way beyond home. You can take those idols with you. They'll travel. There's a little tongue-in-cheek, there's a little sarcasm, and there's a whole lot of pain and hurt. History proves Amos right. The Assyrians soon come and conquer the northern kingdom and take all of Israel into either exile, if you were one of the wealthy leaders, or left without leadership or direction in what used to be home, but now has been laid to ruins. You're left to rebuild without direction, or you're taken away from home and put into servitude. Now, the irony is those who were taken away were usually those who were cheating the others. They were the wealthy. They were the ones of means, the people of privilege. So now all of a sudden, those of privilege are put in a place of servitude. And those who've been taken advantage of are given a chance to forge their own path, but without those that they have leaned on for support and structure. A generation later, the same thing happens to the southern kingdom. Jerusalem eventually falls to Babylon as the next big kingdom arises, and all of God's people, both in the north and the south, experience exile. They experience exile, the distance from home, the experience of servitude, how it feels to have others take advantage of you. Now, it's worth naming that some of our most powerful Bible stories come out of this time of exile. The stories of Daniel, the story of Esther. These are stories from the exiles, and so many of our Psalms, as much as they're written in the spirit of David and his musical abilities, they're not written by David. He gets credit for them kind of in honor of. But if you read them, they're written during the exile. By the rivers of Babylon, we sat down and wept. We hung our harps on the tree because how could we sing a song of the Lord in a strange land? These are songs happening in the exile as they lament, and they look back. They remember the old kingdom. They remember the way things used to be. Much of Scripture, much of the Bible we know today is written in the crucible of exile. It's written because those who were taken away no longer had the holy places to go to. They didn't have anything to remind them of the stories, so they wrote them down so they would not be forgotten. And those who were back home, back sitting in the ruins, the temple was destroyed. The storytellers have all been taken away, so they also clamored to try to record the story, to preserve it for future generations. It is in the crucible of the exile that the Jewish people find ways to name God's presence in the midst of brokenness. A way to celebrate God's presence, literally in the shadow of broken buildings and temples. God's people find a way to share their faith from one generation to the next and the next. And it grows out of this exile experience. In their brokenness, they find beauty. In their brokenness, they find strength. And it is in their brokenness that eventually they find wholeness and pass the invitation on generation to generation till it comes to us today. An invitation to wholeness. We find ourselves often breaking down, and when we do find ourselves feeling broken, feeling worn out or exhausted, we can trust God to put the pieces together again. Sometimes the way they were. God can Humpty Dumpty us right back on the wall. And other times, God puts us together in a new way, forms us into a new creation, something we never saw coming. We can trust that God will put us back together, stronger and still beautiful. Think about the pot at your house, the vase at your house, the family keepsake that fell on the ground. Maybe it was the cookie jar, whatever it was that you glued back together. We know from modern science that a clay pot put back together with super glue is stronger than the original. The glue that we bind it with is actually stronger than the clay, stronger than the china, stronger than the dish. It might be broken, but now it's got a story to it. Now it's got some character. It's not the same as the others who were bought at Sears in that generation. It's not the same as the one that someone made for us. Now the kids have knocked it over, and the grandkids, and it's been pieced back together. There is something beautiful about the mosaic of repair. Over the past couple weeks, we've been talking about the experiences of victims and offenders. For victims, how trauma changes us and how we develop a narrative to try to make sense of things. We've talked about offenders and their experience and how traumatic experience changes us, how we develop a story, a good versus evil story that allows us to hurt someone else out of protection, a way to justify our behavior by the way we interpret someone else. We have talked about the experiences that victims and offenders share, and it's change. Something has been lost. Something will never be the same. The reality is, whether we are a victim of something that's happened or we have been broken ourselves and it's led us to offend against someone else, to be an aggressor, to reach out, to lash out, to dump our issues on those around us, we share the common experience of loss and change. And we also have the same invitation to treat the future different. How we navigate these new realities, this is what can truly define our days going forward. Do we sit in the pit of our hurts and dwell on the broken pieces, like Job, literally scratching ourselves with our brokenness all around us? Or do we rebuild and create a new mosaic, a new creation? Will we blame and seek vengeance, continuing cycles of hurt, assuring that hurt people will continue to hurt people? Or do we let our hearts be reshaped by God? Do we allow God to remold us like the potter? Will we cling to the past and try to recreate it because it's what we knew? Will we find comfort in what we know didn't work? Or will we allow ourselves to go into the mystery of what could be, the potential of the future, the new creation in God's hand? There is something beyond brokenness. There is something beyond brokenness. There is a day after. For God's people, it had to feel like the world ended. When the Assyrians came and conquered and started taking people away. When Babylon came to Jerusalem and did the same, it had to feel like their world had ended. Yet here we are, thousands of years later, retelling their story, claiming the brokenness and the beauty in it, the way God shaped them, reshaped them, and formed them. There is something beyond brokenness. There is something beyond the addiction, beyond the diagnosis. There is something beyond the heartbreak and the grief. There is something beyond our sadness in this day, and we have no idea what it will look like. In the meantime, it may feel like we have been taken into exile. Over time, justice continues to flow like mighty waters, shaping us as a community. Thanks be to God. Thanks be to God that justice continues to roll among us, breaking down structures of slavery, breaking down institutions of sexism, breaking down assumptions of homophobia and hatred. And righteousness continues to flow like a never-ending stream, nurturing us as a community in difficult ways, but giving hope to those who would prophesy and say the hard words, giving vision to those who would lead in difficult circumstances, giving new life to those who were once broken, giving them the courage to be a new creation. Have you lived it? Have you lived through a time of distance from God? Have you lived through your time of exile, from family, from friends, from who you dreamed of being, of the dreams of your youth compared to what is now, a distance from your own spiritual self, a distance from God? Have you lived through your own exile? If so, then you are well positioned to see an important truth. Maybe you've already seen it. If you are, then you are well positioned to testify to a new reality. You are in a position to tell us the story. Those who've been in exile, those who felt the distance from what was normal, from home, from safety, from family, those who felt the distance from God are in a position to see that God was always there. To see that God is not the one who moves, but it's us that moves away from God. It's us who take ourselves into exile beyond God's grace. It's us who take ourselves into exile beyond God's love. It's those of us who have been in the exile, we can tell you, it is us who distance ourselves from God. But those who've come through can also testify, can also prophesy that God is quick to respond. When we stop running away, when we stop pushing others away, when we stop breaking community and make space for others, when we make space for God, when we make space for ourselves to heal and grow, God will transform us. God will transform us, and we will see that God has been working on us all along. God's justice, God's righteousness have been flowing around us all along. The hands of the potter have been shaping us all along, and God's fingerprints are on our hearts and souls. When we stop running away, when we stop pushing others away, when we make room for ourselves to grow and heal, we will see that God has been transforming us all along. God is not done.